First off, thank you, Richard and his team for putting on this event. Just round of applause. As he mentioned, we've been coming here for many years, and it's one of the events I truly look forward to every year. So thank you so much. And while we're on the thank you notes, obviously we heard a lot today about partnership. We heard about the importance of permitting, and I want to thank the Board of Supervisors, the Planning Commissioners, Lorelei, your team, all of the county employees. It takes an army to execute on the vision, and we're doing it. Day by day, we're doing it. So thank you to the entire Kern County team. I also want to take just a second to remember John Spalding. I don't know if folks have heard, but John recently passed, and while we're talking about advocates and people who lifted projects up and really made things happen, that was John. So just let's keep him and his family in our thoughts today. So with that little transition, so typically I talk to you about our projects and technology and all the great things we're doing in Kern County. I'm going to take a little different turn. I'm not going to talk about power plants per se, but I'm going to talk about the flip side of the coin and what our power projects actually do when it comes to conservation. And so I'm happy to announce that today, if you go on YouTube, you can find it. We just launched a video you'll see here in a second that highlights our Onyx Ranch Conservation Project. And so what Onyx is a partnership between the Bureau of Land Management, CDFW, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to relook at conservation and think about new ways of doing things that are at the scale that we do things here in Kern County. And so what we're able to do is we pooled our conservation dollars from our Eland, Kudu, Belfield, and Aratina projects, and we're able to purchase and retire grazing rights on a 215,000 acre piece of property in Kern County to uplift and provide ecological benefit for desert plants and wildlife, the species that we really care about here in the desert. We prepared a quick video that kind of explains Onyx, and so if we could roll that now, that would be great. Environmental stewardship is really at the core of our renewable energy projects. The Onyx Conservation Project is the permanent retirement of grazing rights for the betterment of native plants and wildlife species. Onyx is in the spirit of combating global climate change, which is the key problem our team is working on every day. And it's a chance where we can innovate on things outside of what we're really known for, like advanced solar power plant design and battery systems and building the power plants of the future. The scale of Onyx is really what makes it unique. It's 215,000 contiguous acres. So to put that in perspective, it's about 7 San Franciscos all stacked together. In traditional mitigation, you have small kind of checkerboarded parcels where it's very, very hard to find something as large as Onyx and that's all contiguous. Large and connected areas are really important to wildlife because there aren't other things that could harm them in the way from one really nice conserved property to another. It really has an exponential benefit to native plants and wildlife. We're able to partner with the Bureau of Land Management, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to deliver a conservation project that had never been done before.
What's great about this project is that it's delivering clean, renewable energy via solar power projects, but it's also conserving plant and wildlife species on a very impressive scale.
There are over 20 sensitive species that are found on the Onyx Conservation Project. These include the desert tortoise and Mojave ground squirrel, which were our major focus, as well as California condors, western Joshua trees, a lot of the species that we really want to see thrive in the desert. We've also created an endowment so that we can fund additional projects that will benefit native plants and wildlife species. And we're looking to invest millions of dollars on this property to make sure that it continues to support the species that we're trying to conserve. These public-private partnerships make conservation possible at a scale that we didn't really dream of before. Onyx is in the scale of our ambitions, our portfolio, and my hope is that projects like Onyx can serve as a roadmap, and we can apply this model into other ecosystems where we're trying to deploy renewable energy. When I figured out who I was going to be introducing here for the keynote, and I knew that we were going to be announcing Onyx, I thought this is perfect. It's my honor to introduce David Bernhardt, who was the former director of the Department of Interior. He led two of the agencies that were mentioned in the videos, and really professionally exemplifies what happens when government and industry come together and they have an outmoded benefit that we can put together. I did a little Googling of David and learned some pretty interesting things. So he's the only person ever to be confirmed by the US Senate as the Secretary of the Interior, the Deputy Secretary, and the Solicitor of the Department in its 173-year history. So for those permitting geeks like myself, what that actually means is he was the CEO, the COO, and the Chief Legal Counsel for one of the largest branches of government. The Department of Interior, when David was there, had an asset portfolio that exceeded $300 billion, an annual operating budget of $16 billion, and nearly 70,000 employees. So he's clearly qualified to be talking to you about how we're going to address the problems and challenges that we're going to face. While David was working as Secretary of Interior, he really had a focus on conservation stewardship. He expanded opportunities for hunting and fishing on public lands, drove regulatory change, and really worked to enhance this country's energy independence. One of the great achievements that stuck out to me was his work on the Great American Outdoors Act, which enhanced, preserved, and really provided that ongoing maintenance for some of our most important public lands. Since David left the department, he has returned to practice law, and he's very active in different charitable and business endeavors. Please join me in welcoming the 53rd Secretary of the Department of Interior, Mr. David Bernhardt.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. Can you all hear me? Because I'm deaf. At least I tell my wife that regularly. Now, first for some news. As would be obvious if you look at me, I don't miss lunch, okay? So I promise to keep you on time. Secondly, I'm blind, so I'm going to need my reading glasses. Now, before I begin my remarks, I'd like to say something that is completely off script. Actually, everything I say today will be off script. But Lorelei, you're a gem. There are so few public servants that begin with the notion of let's solve a problem. And I'm going to talk a lot about that today. But I'd really ask everybody to give you a round of applause because it was great listening to you. Now, secondly, and this is completely off topic, but I think it's important. Yesterday, a hometown boy of yours, Kevin McCarthy, was nominated to be the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives by a pretty overwhelming majority. And I wanted to tell you something about that and about you all as a result of that I think is relevant. As somebody who has served in a relatively high level in government myself, I can tell you this, that your values, your judgment, the community that you grew up in has a tremendous impact on every single public policy decision you make as an executive or leader. And I think you as a community should be proud of that. And frankly, we as a nation should take great comfort in that. So thank you very much, and thank you for him. Third, and you don't have to listen to anything else I say today, but this is really important. Thank you. So many of you in the energy industry don't take a moment to reflect upon how absolutely important your work is to everybody in this country every single day. And a gentleman earlier today said something, I think, like the oil industry is the most hated entity on the planet. I can assure you, I served in the Trump administration as the Secretary of the Interior. You are not even close. Just Google me. Eric found all the good comments. In all seriousness, there's also something you can do. Be proud of what you do and communicate it. Communicate it to your neighbors, your friends. What you do is extraordinary. And our economy, if you look at the 2000s, and I don't have those great charts, by the way, they were great. If you look at the 2000s and you look at what was the economic growth in the United States, and where did it come from? It came from energy, technology, and development, and entrepreneurship by people in this room. And that's very important for us not to forget and to remember. Now, with that said, I provided Lorelei some compliments, but let me tell you about my experience in government generally. And that is primarily about getting rid of problems. Lorelei used the word solution. Now, let me begin with getting rid of a problem. I served at the Department of the Interior, and for some of you, you know what that is, but there are many of you that don't. And so let me explain the creation of what became known as the Department of the Interior. In the winter of 1848, the Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Treasury, had a problem. His problem was that there was an organization that had been created in 1812 called the General Land Office, which was an amalgamation of functions within the Department of Treasury that dealt primarily with land sales. And for those of you that don't know, before there was an income tax system, the vast majority of the federal government's revenue came from tariffs and land sales. So land sales were a hotbed of corruption, inappropriate relationships, all sorts of things that were causing the Secretary of Treasury problems. So what did he do? He went to Congress. And his suggestion was this: why don't we create a different agency? Because what would that do? Get rid of his problem. So in the spring of 1849, a number of other secretaries started hearing about this and thought, man, this is a pretty good idea. So suddenly, an entity began to be thought of that would have the General Lands Office, the pension benefits for veterans, the Patent Office, and the War Department thought it'd be a great idea, since the Indian Wars were largely over, to have Indian relations handled in another agency. And quickly, Congress passed that as what is called the Department of Home, but is technically named the Department of the Interior. For the next 173 years, that organization has largely managed about 1 in 5 acres of land in the United States in some way or other, a whole series of surface acreage, subsurface acreage, and administers oil and gas leasing on the Outer Continental Shelf. So I had the opportunity, my wife would say, because I'm suicidal, to serve 11 and a half years in that organization under 2 different secretaries, well, actually 2 different presidents, several different secretaries. And That organization, as was stated, has about 65,000 people. More importantly, it has a lot of stuff. And a lot of people have interest in that stuff. As a matter of fact, not too far from here was one of the biggest scandals of the Department of the Interior, or part of one of the biggest scandals of the Department of the Interior. All of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with Elk Hills. There was a little controversy about Elk Hills called Teapot Dome. Former Secretary of the Interior got in a lot of trouble for that. As a matter of fact, to be honest with you, when I first met with the president to contemplate serving as the Secretary of the Interior, I was the deputy secretary. And to be candid, like, that's the best job in the world if you are interested in policy or natural resources, because you're actually the guy running the Department of the Interior, or gal, and you're the chief operating officer, and it can't get any better than that. And it turned out that during the my boss was resigning or was getting fired. It was a little unclear to me, which is very awkward, okay, to be very candid with you. I'm sure none of you have ever experienced that, but it is awkward. And at the same time, I get a call to go to the Oval Office. Now, to be honest, I've gone to the Oval Office before quite a few times, but never alone. It was like going, being an unsupervised, it's an unchaperoned visit, right? And I show up and I have no idea what to think. I'm very nervous about the whole situation that's unclear to me. And I go in to the lobby and then to the ante room and then ultimately into the Oval. And I'm walking to the Oval and it feels like a really long walk to the Resolute desk. And I got this boss who has a pretty charismatic personality if you've met him or watched him on TV, to be honest. And he's wonderful. And he realizes, because it's probably very clear, that I'm not comfortable, okay? And so we talk, he's trying to make small talk. He asked me if I want a Coke. I said, I really don't want a Coke. I just want to find out what's going to happen with my life. And this is how incredible he is. He spent about 10 minutes just trying to get my heart rate down, which was great. Because at the end of the day, he's really an incredible host. So he gets my heart rate down, and then we kind of talk about the situation. He asks me some questions about the Department of the Interior, lays out what he thinks is some goals for me, basically says, I'm going to be interviewing people for this job as secretary. What should I know about it? And here's the first thing I said. I said, look, anybody who wants that job has no idea what it is. Like, I would not hire that person. Anybody that comes in and says, hey, I want to be that guy, don't hire him. Like, anything else, like, maybe goes, but, like, they have no idea. More secretaries of the Interior have been held in contempt or investigated for crimes than you can ever imagine, okay? And he was great about it, and ultimately, he realized that, like, look, it's a complicated job because it's a complicated process. Now, generally, that doesn't happen with political appointees because Donna Shalala, who was the head of HHS for 8 years, was recently asked about my predecessor just got elected to Congress. He's a great guy named Ryan Zeke. He just got elected to Congress. A reporter asked Donna Shalala, like, what's his experience in Congress as cabinet secretary for 2 years going to mean for his leadership in Congress? And she was great. She says, look, after 2 years as a cabinet secretary, you don't even know where the bathrooms are, like, barely. So it's really going to be irrelevant for his congressional experience. And to be honest, with political appointees, there's some truth to that. Like, it takes a while to figure out some things like laws, process, and procedure. And I tell you that all for a reason, and it goes right back to Lorelei. And here's a reality as you're looking at energy transition and new ways of doing things. There is no one on the planet, and I mean this sincerely because I've spent I've spent thousands of hours of my life on interior-related policy. there was no one on the planet sitting around thinking, how can we do everything much, much better? Most of them are thinking in government, for good or ill, most of them are thinking, how can I get rid of my problem? And just like the creation of the Department of the Interior, I've seen this play out time and time again. I used to call it the dead cat strategy, but like that became socially unacceptable, so I've kind of stopped. I have a daughter who is a dog person. I have a son who likes a cat person. I really can't use either of them anymore. But here's the issue. For many government agencies, when they wake up in the morning and if they went out on their porch and a tragic accident had happened to a cat, let's say hypothetically, they'd look down and see the cat. And their immediate reaction would be, how can I move this cat to somebody else's porch? Now you laugh. I'll give you an example. When I was in, when I served in the Bush administration, which was a wonderful experience, a little different than the Trump experience. In the Bush administration, I fixed a problem, like in my last week in Interior as the chief legal officer, I thought I fixed this problem, which involved a funding issue between the Treasury Department and Interior. So I leave. I'm gone for 9 years, all right? 9 years. I come back, and during my confirmation, which is a wonderful process to go through if you haven't. I've done it 3 times. Every time I do it, my vote numbers go down. I start out unanimously, and it just keeps clipping down. You end up with a lot of interesting questions. So a senator says to me, hey, I have this issue, and it needs to be resolved. And he tells me, and I'm like, well, I wouldn't worry about that issue because I resolved it 9 years ago. And he's like, no, you didn't. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure I did, but when I get over there, I'll take a look. So I get over there, I flip up the hood, and sure enough, I'd written this legal memo. I thought I had it all worked out. And somebody had decided at Treasury, somebody had decided, well, look, this is a little complicated. Why don't we ask Congress if they might just clarify everything for us? And for 9 years, nobody did anything about the matter. A little community needed money that they were lawfully entitled to. The money was in an account. All it needed is somebody to say, pay the damn people. And they waited 9 years for clarification. And getting Congress to clarify anything, it's a lot of work. I mean, honestly, it's a lot of work. And so my point of that is, you have an incredible opportunity with people like David Valadao, your senators, Representative McCarthy, who's likely to be Speaker. If you have things that work here, I would get Lorelei up to Congress and be telling the hearings this would be a great suggestion of what they had to do federally. So that was a major point, and I think it's worth you thinking about that, honestly, because no one's going to solve your problem until you give them a solution. It's too complex. Nobody may like that, but that is the reality, because let me tell you what happens when you really try and solve problems. I've dealt with permitting on every way you can internally. I've written memos, I've written regulations, I've done a lot of stuff on that, honestly. And as I've done it, I leave, and people spend a lot of time undoing it, which is completely why we have elections, and that's appropriate. But then Congress says, well, maybe they'll do it, and we start the process all over again. And that's sort of counterproductive when you look at the screens that we have. And we can do better, because it's absolutely amazing what happens if you just say, hey, we can fix this and let's try. Let me give you an example. When I came into the Department of the Interior, on average with BLM, it was taking 4.2 years to do an environmental impact statement. And I think Lorelei told me the other day that you're at like 1.2 years for, which I love that number, by the way, and I'm gonna tell you why in a minute. And so the state directors of BLM, there's a state director for BLM for California, there's one for Nevada. They're senior executive service officers, which means, you know, if they were in the Department of Defense, they would be the equivalent of a brigadier general. So they're big deals in the civil service, honestly. So I met with a bunch of them, and they were really frustrated with the Department of the Interior and BLM's headquarters review of documents that they worked on through a process that's called a Federal Register notice. Some of you may have experienced this. But basically what happens is a team in a field office and a state office may work on a project for years. And then they get it to a point where either they're starting it, so they have to go through an approval process, or they're at a draft environmental impact statement, they got to go through this process, or they're at final. And what they do, or what they did, is the state director would send it to Washington. And Washington had this extensive process to review it. Now, they told me about the process, they wanted it fixed, and I said, okay, well, let me go figure out, like, what's the basis for the process? And, you know, I'm the deputy secretary, so I got a little bit of clout, right? You would think, not really. But I said, show me how this process began. And there's nothing written down about it. It's all lore, but I'm going to tell you it now. So one day, apparently in the mid-90s, the chief of staff of the Secretary of the Interior is sitting in his office. And it is a very nice office. Like, it has wood paneling. It's a beautiful office for a government office, okay? And he's sitting in it, and it's probably about 8 o'clock, maybe 7:30 in the morning. He sits down with his coffee on his nice desk. He picks up one of 3 newspapers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post. I don't know for sure which one, but I know it was one of those 3 because I worked at Interior for 11 years, 11 months and 20-some days, and I could never get any other newspaper. So he opened one of them, and he saw a story about the Department of the Interior that he really was surprised by. And if you're the chief of staff to the secretary, that's uncomfortable, right? So what had happened, apparently, is a Federal Register notice had gone out to the public reading room. Somebody had read a story and wrote a story about it, and nobody had told the chief of staff. So the chief of staff said, I want to read all Federal Register notices before they go to the Federal Register. Now, I am confident that he had no idea what that meant, but immediately he finds himself buried in Federal Register notices. A few days later, the deputy secretary walks in his office, and you can just imagine this guy went from 3 newspapers to like folders, right? And the deputy secretary says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm reading Federal Register notices. And the deputy secretary, without missing a beat, says, that's an operational responsibility. I run the Department of the Interior. Why would you be doing that? You're a staffer. I need to read the Federal Register notices. So suddenly, you need the approval of the deputy secretary before you get your Federal Register notice out. Now, the minute that happens, the chief lawyer of the department, the solicitor, finds out about this, and he has to read everything before the deputy secretary reads it, okay? When that happens, suddenly you have the top few people in the department reading something or appearing to. And the next thing you know, every assistant secretary thinks they need to read it because they don't want to get in trouble with what their boss does. After that, all of the deputy assistants need to look at it. Their people need to look at it. And when I arrive 25 years later, 35 people are looking at a document. As far as I can tell, none of them adding value, but all of them putting their signature on it. So here's what we did. I said, well, you guys hate this process, and they were very clear about that. And I said, okay, well, what if we did this? What if you, state director, read the document and put your signature on it saying, I've read it? And you have a lawyer do that, because I am a lawyer and I believe in equal employment for all lawyers, okay? Like, that has to happen. But if the two of you do that, then what I'll do is I'll read the document. And if I think the document's good enough to go, they'll go to the Federal Register. Now, because there's 30 people or more who would like to participate in this process, here's what we'll do. We'll tell them, here's the document, and we'll do a phone call with everybody on it. And I'm going to ask you, State Director, some questions about this. And here's what you need to know. I actually read. Now, the first few calls we did this way were difficult because it was apparent that the state directors didn't believe that I could read. But it turned out that as we did that, it was an enlightening thing to them because they realized what kind of garbage was in these 1,500-page documents. And when I say that, I'm not denigrating anybody who works on an EIS. I'll just say if you've read one, the entire purpose of NEPA is to provide consideration of alternatives and help the decision maker make an informed decision. That second purpose is never met if nobody reads the document, in my opinion, okay? But it's also never met if it's so thick that no one could read it. And now, lawyers have convinced people that they should write a bigger document. And I had a long talk with our lawyers about that and explained to them that if you give me a 25,000-page document, which we have a few of, I can show you where the right hand had no idea what the left hand wrote. And as a lawyer on the outside, when I'm fighting the government, I love that. Absolutely love it. But a concise 150-page document is pretty good. But as these SESers read them, they realized the work product that was being generated, and the work product went up. They were more informed about the decision, and they made a better decision about it. But more importantly, our processing by the end of our tenure by doing that, on average, went from BLM spending 4.2 years on an EIS to an average of 1.3. Not that much worse than Lorelei's process. Now, there were a couple other things that went into that. One was having a deadline. Can you imagine if we asked all of the reporters in the world to write articles whenever they wanted? How many articles a week do you think the average reporter would write? So deadlines are important. Now, keeping that deadline is hard, but we did that, and we dramatically improved the product. So why I tell you that, because I want you to recognize that you all should have faith that government can change, and it can change really for the better. But it takes a couple of things, one of which almost has to come from you. It takes good ideas. And then it takes the willingness to insist on the idea from an executive and demand it and hold people accountable. And that's where things get difficult, because we've moved into a system of government where, you know, at the end of the first Congress, the State Department had, and this is a question, how many people do you think were at the State Department? Anybody got a guess? 50, 100? What did you say? Do you know the answer? Like, I've never had that happen before. There actually were 4. That's a pretty damn good guess. There was a secretary and 3 clerks. Now, think about that for a minute. Think about that for a minute. When we founded our country, that was the thought of how the government would work. And if you actually look at the law, what the law actually says, like for the Secretary of the Interior, I had 2 job descriptions. The Constitution basically says I'm supposed to provide advice to the president, which is very clear. And secondly, I was to supervise all of the work in the department. Well, supervise is actually an active term. It's not necessarily passive. And we have moved from a view in our world that our decision makers shouldn't be obligated to do this very complicated thing that comes with their job called work. And we have to begin to demand that of them. And if we do, they will do it. And why do I tell you all of this? I tell you this because there was a slight change in direction as a result of the recent election. And if I'm an administration, and I'm an administration guy, so the job in the administration is very simple. It's to faithfully and well and faithfully execute the law, and do that in the context where you have the discretion to be consistent with driving the president's agenda forward, whatever that is, and that's why we have elections. And in this instance, in this time frame, there was, in the last election, there was a contrast of energy policy that was resolved with the outcome of a change in administration. And for the next 1,461 days after that, that policy vision should be the driver within a government agency. And to be fair to this administration, they got off to a pretty good clip on their policy vision. Now, I happen to not agree with much of it, and that's not, doesn't really matter to any of you, but the reality is they got off on a pretty good clip. They basically began to undo a lot of my work. They paused a lot of leasing, and that's okay. And then we moved forward on their green energy vision. They front-loaded and successfully got a whole host of legislation that's important to many people in this room. Very, very positive thing for them and that vision. And the election outcome means for them, not necessarily for anybody else, but for them, with the Senate in the situation it's currently in, they'll get new nominees if they want them. And the House change is significant in that it means the likelihood of them getting significant new legislative initiatives goes down, so no big windfall profits tax or things like that. It also brings accountability and transparency to their actions, which you can be happy with or not, but I would say this, that it is important, it is an important part of the process to have a degree of accountability. And that will be utilized to showcase failures of the administration, but equally important, by having another arm of the legislative branch with a potentially different policy view, that means there's an opportunity to highlight new and better ideas. And I would expect that that would happen. And there's also an opportunity for finding consensus on issues that have the potential to be bipartisan. And one of those, I believe right now, because of the collective view of a need for an improved energy paradigm, I do believe that there's an opportunity for some good legislative ideas on permitting reform that could be bipartisan. And that is why I began this speech with the notion about sending Lorelei to Congress or whatever else you might come up with here, because those ideas, what you need and what you need, the country needs to improve the way we go about building things in terms of improving them. Because if we don't, we're at a grave disadvantage. We're in a situation now where our policymakers, and I'm not saying that this is wrong, but I find it incredibly hard to defend, which I guess means I think it's wrong. We're at a point that we have tremendous natural resource wealth here. We're increasingly dependent in some areas on foreign delivery of resources from very, very unstable places. And in some instances, our solution is not to ask for us to manage our resources in a way that would allow us to produce them. But instead, for example, with mining, we're about to suggest that we take money from infrastructure bills, the IRA, and send it to Canada, so taxpayers' dollars to Canada for them to produce minerals so that we're not dependent on China. And while that may make sense from a national security point at some level, it is completely nonsensical to me. And when I know that when you look at oil and gas and you say, look, let's not do it here, but let's ask another country to produce it, that doesn't intellectually meet a test for me that would be like, what's your policy consistency? I'm not asking that you, articulate a policy that works. Like, I would really never do that. But how can you say my primary philosophy is dealing with climate change if I'd like to just stop here and not somewhere? That makes no sense to me if you buy into the whole scheme. Like, it is a nonsensical position. A marketer would never come up with that as like a political solution. You know, at the end of the day, the solution has to line up with your problem in some way, and we're just not quite there. So my view of the future for energy policy, for what it's worth, is that there is an opportunity for bipartisanship on a limited number of things, and you ought to be looking at those and thinking about those over the next couple of years. If you were dependent on or excited about the incentives and taxes and financials in recently passed legislation, those are going to be here for the next 10 years if I had to bet on it. No issue. No issue because of the composition of Congress. If you wanted a lot more legislatively, that's probably not going to happen. And the beauty of all of that is that's probably exactly where the American people are right this minute. And what I hope you take away from my visit, for what it's worth, is that at the end of the day, we have to have a great confidence in the American people, because they look at the actions their government are taking, and it may take them a couple of elections, but they always find the right outcome for us. And when you look at the charts that were up here, you see that we need an all-of-the-above approach to energy. We need every ounce of energy that we can produce. We need it produced wisely and responsibly, and there's a profit market for it at the end of the day, but we need it. No one ever is going to tell their children that they should have less than I have. Oh, well, I've tried. I mean, to be candid with you, I've tried it a lot. I have a 17-year-old daughter. All I get is Amazon boxes. But truthfully, no one in society, no one in human history would say the next generation should artificially sacrifice. That will not happen. It will never happen. And we have to have our policies based on rational human activity. So with that, I'd be happy to take 5 minutes of questions on anything I don't like. I'm a former official, so I just won't answer it. Thank you for your time.